Hello and welcome to Twilight of the Gods. Today we are going to teach you how to teach your friends to play the game. So the first thing when introducing someone who is not familiar with Twilight of the Gods is you want to check and see if they have any experience with other types of deck dueling games. Games like Magic, Yu-Gi-Oh, Pokemon, Game of Thrones, Netrunner, card games of those types. Because if they know the language of those games, it will be very easy for them to pick up Twilight of the Gods. If they are not familiar with those types of games, don't worry, it's perfectly okay. You will be able to teach them how to play as long as you follow our handy-dandy simple tips to playing Twilight of the Gods. All right, so first thing in Twilight of the Gods. In this game, your deck is your life. This is very different than most other card games. In most other card games, you use either dice or pen and paper or a phone app to kind of keep track of everything that's going on. In our game, Twilight of the Gods, as long as you can keep drawing cards, you're still alive. The instant that last card goes away, you are dead. You do not get to play anymore. So remember to keep that in mind. Deck is your life. Second thing in Twilight of the Gods, you are playing as an actual deity from the 6th century AD. The Roman Empire is collapsing, other empires around the world are collapsing, and the pantheons are collapsing with them. So you and a friend will be taking on the role of gods. Here's a god right here. The god cards have special abilities. You can see them on the card itself. We'll get into that in just a little bit, but it is important to know that you are actually playing as a god, as is the other person. You're battling against each other to gather scraps of power. Okay, so basic setup of the game. You will want to make a 50-card deck. Remember, this is what you're going to be teaching other people too, so don't be afraid to explain it exactly the way I'm explaining it here. That's why we're making this video. So first thing in the game, 50-card deck. The deck can be any color of cards, any combination of cards. The only restrictions are 3 of any one normal card and 1 of any epic card. Epic cards have the little golden border on the front. You can see right there. And that's to let you know that they are more powerful than other cards, as well as you can only have 1 of them in your deck. The only other restriction on deck building is on your god card. You will see a number. For example, Mars has the number 10. That means you must include a minimum of 10 red cards to be able to use Mars as your god. Different gods will have different faction requirements. That number will always tell you what the minimum amount of cards is. Okay. Once you start playing the game, you don't necessarily need to worry about deck building at first because the game itself comes with 4 pre-made 50-card decks that have all been balanced against each other. So if you're just picking up the box, you and your friends, you want to learn how to play, you want to teach them how to play, we recommend sorting those cards into their pre-made decks. You can tell which cards belong to which decks by the little gem on the bottom right corner of every card. There's a red gem, a blue gem, a green gem, and a brown gem. If you separate all the gems into their respective stacks, you will have the 4 pre-made starter decks. It'll be very easy for you to teach the game. Once each player has their 50-card life stack, the start of the game will be drawing 7 cards. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So starting hand size, 7 cards. Let's get into what the cards actually are now. So a basic anatomy of a card. On the back of the cards, you will see that there are tier levels. Tiers 1, 2, and 3. These tier levels are your resources. These are what allow you to summon other cards in the game. Now, very different than other card games of this type, you do not play resources from your hand face down as your own resources. Instead, you get resources from your opponent and vice versa by trading cards with each other. That will happen during the trade phase, which I will go into once we start getting into the anatomy of the turn. Right now, we're still on the anatomy of the cards because you have to know what your cards do before you can play the game. So, back of the cards are the resources. This is very important. You only get them from your opponents. You never get them from yourself. Okay, let's take a look at the front of the cards. A basic card anatomy, right here. In the upper left of the card, you can see the tier level of the card. This will always match with the tier level on the back of the card, and it allows you to see what the card's resource value is without constantly flipping the card over and checking the back. In the upper right is the summoning cost of the card. Those are the resources required in order to summon cards and put them into play. You must use the exact types of resources. You cannot substitute one resource for another resource. For example, this card, Cataphracts of the Sand, you would need 1 tier 3, 2 tier 2s, and 2 tier 1s in order to summon that card. In our game, we do not tap lands for mana, we exhaust aspects for power. You need to be able to generate power in order to summon your cards, which then come onto the playing field. If you have played other card games of the types I mentioned earlier, you will recognize this mechanic as being very familiar. All right, the upper left side of the card will tell you what type of card it is. In this case, this is a creature. There are 4 different types of cards in this game. I will go into what each specific type does in just a little bit, but for right now, you can see that they are different both in the lettering as well as the artistic style, so that way it's easy to tell at a glance what type of card it is. A creature will always be the tan leather-looking lettering, an intrigue is always the white scroll work, a fortification is always the brickwork, and a scheme is always the lightning bolt. As you get some games in, you will notice that it's very easy to tell these cards apart. In the middle of the card is the name of the card, as well as what type it is if it has any subtypes. For example, Cataphracts of the Sand has subtypes Sasanian and Army. Other cards may interact with those subtypes. Don't worry about that too much right now. We're just learning how to play the game. You'll also notice that the middle of the card for each card type is different based on the card type, which is another way to tell which card is which. Creatures will always have a fight and life value. Fortifications will always have a location. Schemes will always have nothing. Intrigues will always have an upkeep cost. We tried to put a lot of these little hints and just sort of visual cues into the game to make it so that once you learn the language of the game, it is very easy to pick it up. All right, next up, this white box right here, this is the text of the card. This will tell you what it does while it is in the field of play. Generally, every card will tell you something different with what it does. It is up to you as the player to figure out which cards are best for which situations. We recommend reading through all your cards before playing the game, so then that way you have an idea of what your deck does and what the cards do. Then once you start getting into deck building, you'll start picking the cards that you like best and putting them together to create your optimal deck. At the bottom of the card, this black box right here, this is called the heresy effect. Now, this is very important and another unique mechanic in Twilight of the Gods, because remember how I mentioned earlier that you only get resources by trading with your opponent. Now, when you trade cards face down with each other, so neither of you knows what the other is trading. And the reason why you don't know is because this heresy box at the bottom, there are many ways in this game to flip a card from a face down resource into a face up resource. Once a card is flipped face up as a resource, you immediately resolve the heresy effect. Then at the end of the turn, the card will flip back face down. It will still be a resource during that entire time. What does this mean from a practical standpoint? It means you're not only trading resources with each other, you are also trading traps. Twilight of the Gods is a game about outsmarting your opponent and gambling on that you can make better use of the traps that you've given them than the ones that they have given you. Always pay attention to your heresy effects. It's also possible to make a deck where you're not that concerned about heresy effects and manifesting, but as you get more and more in-depth into the game, you'll find it gives you a deeper layer to explore. Okay, so that is the basic anatomy of a card. Now we'll go into the specific cards. The first type of card is a creature card. Creatures are the most common ways to damage your opponent. They remain on the battlefield when summoned. They cannot attack the turn they come into play. They are acclimating to the battlefield. They are not summoning sick. Creatures exhaust to attack unless they have the keyword relentless, which is explained in the glossary. Creatures cannot block other creatures if they are exhausted. Creatures block on a one-to-one basis. You cannot block multiple creatures into a single creature. Creatures have a fight value, which is the amount of damage they deal to other creatures, and they have a life value, which is the amount of damage they can take. Damage in this game is permanent. When a creature takes damage, it will acquire a wound marker. In this case, this Cataphracts of the Sand has acquired 1 wound. It now only has 3 life. The reason this is important is because when creatures attack other players' life stacks or discard stacks, they deal damage based on the creature's current life. So it's worthwhile to chip down a bigger creature because then it will deal less damage to you as a player. Note, though, that creatures will always deal their full damage to other creatures. There's no way to bring that down by them taking damage. Okay, last thing on creatures. In our game, in order to prevent rush decks from spiraling out of control very quickly on during the early game, we have what is called creature limit. Creature limit is where you can only have as many creatures of this type out as you have resources of that type. So, for example, in order to support this Cataphracts of the Sand, I would need at least 1 tier 3 resource in play in order for that creature to remain in play. I could play a second tier 3 creature if I wanted, but the instant that second tier 3 creature hit the field, I would then have to kill one or the other because I would only have one tier 3 resource. I could only support one tier 3 creature. Resources support creatures of their types. If you have 2 tier 1 resources, 2 tier 2 resources, and 1 tier 3 resource, you can support 2 tier 1 creatures, 2 tier 2 creatures, and 1 tier 3 creature. Creature limit is very important to keep track of because if you start losing resources, which I will get into in just a second on how you can do that, you need to pay attention to make sure you're not losing a bunch of creatures too. All right, next type of card is fortifications. Fortifications, ding ding. Fortifications are very similar to enchantments from Magic in that they remain in play. They generally give you an ongoing benefit of some type, and they are limited by their location. So as you can see on each fortification, they have a little location marker that indicates a point on the compass rose, north, south, east, or west. You can have as many fortifications on a location as you like. The latest fortification to come into play will go on top of any previous fortifications, and only the topmost fortification is active. So some fortifications actually build off each other. You would need for example, Nomad Camp. If Nomad Camp is in play, it will summon a Nomad. If Nomad Camp is in play on top of the Sand Dune, it will summon a Nomad that also gets +2/+2 because it gets 2 blessing counters. So your Nomads become much, much stronger. Comboing up fortifications is possible and will definitely be something we're exploring in future expansions. All right, next up, intrigues. Intrigues are very similar to fortifications in that they remain in play. They generally give you an ongoing benefit or do something to your opponent. However, unlike fortifications, there is no limit to the amount of intrigues you can have in play. This is because each intrigue comes with an upkeep cost on the middle right of the card. This upkeep cost must be paid at the start of every turn. Now, if you can't pay the full upkeep cost, you will pay as much as possible, then the intrigue will exhaust and will have no effect that turn. Intrigues are very dangerous double-edged swords in that they will give you more benefits than a fortification normally will. However, intrigues can also drain your power very, very quickly, so you need to be careful when you use them. Last card type, schemes. Schemes are like instants. You cast them from your hand. You can play them on either your turn or your opponent's turn. The other 3 types of cards can only be played on your turn during the summoning phase. When you play a scheme, it hits the battlefield, it resolves its effect, and then the scheme goes into the discard stack. These are ways that you can influence the outcome of fights between creatures. You can do nasty effects to your opponents. You can heal yourself. Schemes are sort of your instant way to respond and shift the odds in your favor. You'll notice on schemes, they have a little lightning bolt to tell you what they are. They have no other effects on the middle, just what the scheme does, and then boom, it goes into the discard stack. All right, those are the 4 basic card types that you'll be using throughout the course of the game. A 5th card type, one that each player has, is the God card. The God is who you are playing as on the battlefield. In this case, this is Mars. Now, each God has a special once per game ability that you can use whenever you meet the conditions. In Mars's case, you would have to be attacking and you would use it after defenders have been declared. Then he would use his special power to give one of his creatures initiative, which is first strike, and then that would finish the first part of Mars's active ability. Now, you'll notice on Mars, there's a little chain symbol to the side. That chain symbol also appears on a lot of other cards. What that chain symbol means is conviction. Conviction is where all your cards, both in play and in your discard stack, are the same color as your God. You can find the color of a card both by the faction symbol behind the text. You can find it on the side of the card right there, and on the normal cards themselves, they have both the color and the faction symbol above the card name. This is so colorblind players can actually play our game, which is fairly important. You should be able to play games. Anyways, back to the God card. If you have conviction, so if all your cards in play and in your discard stack are the same color as your God, you have conviction, and you qualify for any conviction bonuses on cards that you have. The instant a card that is not the color of your God either comes into play or goes into the discard stack, you have lost conviction. You no longer get any of your conviction bonuses until you find a way to get back into conviction. This means if you want to make a monocolor deck, you'll be very strong within what that faction does. However, if you choose to spread out and make a multicolor deck, you'll have access to a lot more options, but each of those options won't be as individually strong as if you had specialized in a particular faction. Once you use a God's once per game deity ability, you then flip the God over. So that way you know that the ability has been used and you get to stare at the shiny card art on the back. Everyone loves shiny card art. All right. Last thing in our game that makes it unique from other games is that in our game, we have something called the sacrifice mechanic. Now, in a lot of other card games, there are lots of ways to counter what your opponent is doing, whether it be cards from your hand or specific mechanics built into the game. This gives rise to permission decks, where one player gets to play the game, the other person has to ask permission to play the game. In our game, you cannot build a permission deck. There is only one counterspell, it's in blue, and it only counters schemes. However, any player at any time can destroy, i.e. remove from the game, any card in play or being played by sacrificing resources equal to that card's printed casting cost. What this means is that every player has access to a counterspell, but it will always hurt you to use that counterspell. You'll notice on the more expensive cards, for example, like this Cataphracts of the Sand, if someone wants to sacrifice to remove this card from the game, it's going to cost them quite a lot of resources. 2 tier 1s, 2 tier 2s, and 1 tier 3 in this case. To remove a Nomad Camp would only cost 2 tier 1 resources. So, more expensive cards are harder to get out, but they are also a bit more protected against sacrifice. Once you get into higher level play, knowing when and what to sacrifice against is generally going to determine who will win and lose the game. This is also where creature limit will come into play. As you lose resources from sacrificing, make sure to check your creature limit. Okay, so those are the basic card types, as well as the basic anatomy of the card. Now we can go through a quick sample turn order with which you would teach someone how to play the game. So first thing you would do to start the game, get your 50 card deck, 50 cards, shuffle your 50 card deck, so that way the cards are randomized, shuffle, shuffle, shuffle. Then it's generally polite to ask your opponent to cut, so that way you don't know what's on top. You'll notice that the top card of your deck will always be visible. However, it is visible to both players, so there is no prior knowledge that one person can take advantage of and the other one can't. In addition, during the first player's first turn, they will draw 1 card. Every turn thereafter, you will be drawing 2 cards. So you'll always know what that first card is, but you won't know what that second card is. It might be the same, it might be different, you just don't know. All right, so starting the game. I have shuffled my deck, I have cut it, I have put my deck down. Presumably my opponent is across from me and is doing the same. Now, I will draw my starting hand of 7 cards. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. We generally recommend having 2 to 3 tier 1s in your starting hand because you'll want to trade 1 or 2 away and that leaves you 1 to play. If you get 2 or 1, then we would recommend taking a mulligan, which is where you'll shuffle these 7 cards back into your deck, reshuffle your deck, and draw 7 new cards, and then play the game. For competitive play, you only get 1 full mulligan. If you're playing with your friends, do whatever you want, you're playing with your friends. we don't really care. So this is a pretty decent starting hand. I have 3 tier 1s, 3 tier 2s, and a tier 3, which will give me plenty of options for both trading cards as well as playing cards. So I will be playing as the first player in this game. I have drawn my 7 cards. The first phase in a turn is the refresh phase. That's where any resources that are face down, that are exhausted, now get refreshed and are available to be used for that turn. Since no resources are in play, we ignore the refresh phase. This will also apply to creatures and anything else that's exhausted as well. After the refresh phase is the draw phase. Since it's the first player's first turn, I will only draw 1 card. Every turn thereafter, we will be drawing 2 cards when it is each person's turn. So on my opponent's turn, they will draw 2, then I will draw 2, they will draw 2, so on and so forth. After the draw phase is the trade phase. This is where you and your opponent trade cards with each other. Now, trading is generally 1-to-1 in that the person whose turn it is will offer a trade. For example, I could say, I will offer you, my opponent, 1 tier 1 and 1 tier 2 in exchange for 1 tier 1 and 1 tier 2. My opponent can either accept the trade, they can make a counter offer, they could say, well, I really don't need the tier 2, but I'll trade you a tier 1 for a tier 1, in which case I need to decide if I want to accept that trade or make a different counter offer. Or they can just decide not to trade. If a player ever says no trades, then it immediately shuts the trade phase down. That's to keep one person from bothering another person over and over again. We highly encourage table talk during trade phases. You can offer whatever you want. You can make suggestions to your opponent. If you see them mulling over a particular trade, you could say, well, you know, I have a tier 3 in here that I'd probably be willing to trade if you're interested, even if it's not your turn. Trades also do not have to be 1-to-1. They can be asymmetrical. For example, you could offer a tier 3 for 3 tier 1s. It's entirely up to you. We recommend that they be 1-to-1, but later on in the game, after people start sacrificing, you might start noticing that trades do get asymmetrical. In addition, you could also say, I will trade you my hand for a ham sandwich. It's entirely up to you. We can't enforce your collection of the ham sandwich. That's between you and your opponent. We merely provide the framework. Generally, though, we recommend trades happen on a one-to-one basis. Okay, so during this trade phase, I will offer my opponent a tier 1 and a tier 2 for a tier 1 and a tier 2. Generally, my opponent will say yes, because we both need resources in order to play our cards. Neither of us has established a board state, and we each think we can outsmart each other. So in this case, if we traded, my cards would go face down to my opponent's aspect stack. My opponent's cards would then come face down to my aspect stack. They are not yet in play, but they will be available to be put into play during the resource phase, which is coming up. So let's say, for example, though, that me and my opponent weren't able to trade with each other. Well, we have two other options of what we can do. The first option is if the top card of my life stack matches the top card of my opponent's life stack, in this case a tier 2 and a tier 2, I can immediately do what's called a force trade, where I can take the top card, boom, put it immediately into my opponent's aspect stack, and then take their top card and put it into my aspect stack. This is a way for sort of some randomness to get in the game that you can never be sure that you can completely lock someone out from trading. There's always a chance that forced trading can happen. The third way you can acquire resources is if you don't trade and if you don't force trade. You can't force trade if you did a normal trade. You can go to the seize phase, which is after the trade phase. During the seize phase, you can take a resource from your opponent's hand, but it will cost you cards from your own hand. It will cost you 3 cards to seize a tier 1, 4 cards to seize a tier 2, and 5 cards to seize a tier 3. One of these cards will be removed permanently from the game. The other 4 will go face up into your discard stack. So if you want to take resource advantage, it's going to cost you hand advantage, and you have to decide whether or not it's worth it. All right, so that covers acquiring resources. You can either trade, force trade, or seize, one of the 3. You can never do more than one of the 3 in any given turn. After the seize phase is the resource phase. This is where you take resources that are face down in your aspect stack. You choose one of them, it's your choice, no matter how many you have, to put into play. A resource comes into play fresh, where it is immediately available to be exhausted for power. You use that power to pay for the summoning costs on the upper right of your cards. In this case, if I had one tier 1 resource in play, I could generate 1 tier 1 power. Thus, the only cards I could summon would be cards that cost 1 tier 1 power. After the resource phase is the summoning phase. Here is where you actually get to play cards from your hand out on the battlefield. Creatures, fortifications, intrigues. You can play schemes during this phase as well. However, generally you want to play schemes on your opponent's turn because it's a way for you to mess with what they're doing. The summoning phase, you can play as many cards as you have the resources for. You'll find early in the game, you'll probably only be able to play 1 card. Mid-game, you'll play 1, maybe 2 cards a turn. Late game, you'll play 2, maybe 3 cards a turn. The resource base we recommend players build up is 2 tier 1s, 2 tier 2s, and 1 tier 3. That will allow you to play most of the cards in the starter decks. After the summoning phase is the combat phase. This is where creatures get to attack the opponent. So whoever's player's turn it is, in this case my turn, I would then get to choose any of my creatures that had already been in play for at least 1 turn to attack my opponent. Now when creatures attack, they declare an attack against either the life stack or the discard stack. When creatures hit the life stack, they deal their current life and damage. And then when creatures hit the discard stack, they deal their current life halved, rounded up. So in this case, this would destroy 1 card from the discard stack if I swung at the discard stack. The attacker declares all of his or her attacking creatures and what their targets are, either life or discard stack. The defender then chooses what creatures they would like to block with. This isn't a game where you can choose specifically to attack your opponent's creatures, they have to choose to block with them. Once blockers and attackers have been assigned, then you resolve damage between creatures first, then damage from creatures to discard stacks, then damage from creatures to life stacks. Once that's all done, the combat phase is over, and you move on to the end phase. The end phase is where any resources that have been manifested or flipped face up are now flipped back face down. If you have more than 1 resource in that area, for example, if this cauterize had been manifested and I had another resource face down, I would flip the cauterize face down, then randomize both those cards, so that way neither of us knows where that trap is. You will always know where your first trap is. You will generally not know where subsequent traps are. After the end phase, it is now the other person's turn, where you go through the steps of the turn, each phase, for them, and then it will come back to you. The game ends when one player runs out of life. Once your last card in your life stack goes, boom, you are dead. So that is Twilight of the Gods. It can take a little bit to get into it. I know this is a lot of information, but feel free to watch this over and over. Contact us if you have questions. We have a rules forum on boardgamegeek.com under Twilight of the Gods. And we are more than happy to answer any questions that you have. We want people to get in this game. We want people to enjoy this game because once you get over that initial hurdle, we think you'll find that this offers a lot of complexity and layers that you will greatly enjoy. So thank you for watching and enjoy Twilight of the Gods.